Better has to be defined. Everything should start with topics you want to own. How is this easier to understand? How is this more in depth? How is this really easy to read? What are people trying to achieve? The work is not done when the piece of content is published. The number one goal should obviously be to be as visible in search engines as possible. That does not mean that you're just writing for a machine and not for a user, right? Those go more and more hand in hand. How can we make this relatable? And I'm German, we're very straightforward folks in general. The number one thing is differentiation, and the way to differentiate is to create something that is impossible for others to replicate or takes a ton of effort and therefore it's only possible for you. You either meet user intent or you don't. This idea that a marketer can write about everything without talking to experts, that's over.
Tell me a little bit about your content marketing philosophy and how has it evolved over time?
Love that question. My philosophy has changed over time so far that at the beginning it was very, I would say, focused on the content itself. And today I'm at a place where I'm focusing much more on the system and the machine behind it. So in all of my work, whether that's content related, SEO related, or creator related, I always try to look at the system or the engine, what the different parts are and how to improve different parts of it, right? And it can be very tangible, related to the content creation process, the content creation pipeline, all the different steps in there. Or it can also be related to the actual experience that users go through. And I've had a lot of thoughts and maybe some contrarian opinions about that when it comes to content, especially for SEO.
Excellent. Break down the machine just a little bit more, because that's something, as I've progressed in my career, I know that I started to focus a lot more on how the moving pieces work, and kind of tell me about the pivot in that sort of philosophy. Like, what is your philosophy behind building the machine, and what should it do? Because this is something I could talk about all day long, and I love it. I love it.
Yeah, for sure. So I generally believe that any process that you repeat can be looked at similar to a machine with inputs and outputs and everything that happens in between, right? So with every repeatable process, you probably go through a number of steps, and you can optimize these steps, and you can string them better together, or maybe even skip some steps to make the process more faster or higher quality, or whatever you're optimizing for actually. So when it comes to writing, right, there's often a draft, then some editing, a couple of editing steps, and maybe publishing. And that might be a very simplified version, but I think there can be smaller steps beforehand, like the research process, right, or maybe the outlining process. And in my mind, there's what I'm trying to do is I always try to elevate to the meta level, right, where you're not in the work, but you look at the work, you look at the different steps that it takes to create a piece of content. And then you ask yourself, okay, where is most of that value created? Can be in the editing process, but it can also be in the research process. Sometimes, that's where, when it comes to stuff like data stories or, like non-SEO focused content, I think that's where a lot of the value comes from, is in getting unique data or interpreting data or thinking about a unique angle and then actually writing the piece. And so once you understand where the value in all of these different steps actually happens, then you can flip the model on its head and say, okay, if that's where most of the value comes from, that's where we're going to focus on most of the time. And everything else, we're going to backload, right? And this idea comes from from this concept of bottlenecks. And there's one amazing book. I'm an avid reader. I love paper books. There's a little selection behind me, but there's books all around me here, actually. And one amazing book that has taught me that system thinking is called The Goal by Yahoo Goldratt. And it's an amazing story about bottlenecks and how to optimize bottlenecks and understanding where the process is slow or not slow. And to make that a bit more, like tangible. So I'm focused, or I've spent a lot of time in SEO, content marketing, and oftentimes it's a numbers game when it comes to creating content for SEO, but it's also a quality game. And so by thinking about the content creation process and content from a machine perspective or systems perspective, you're able to, like optimize for results, optimize for traffic, while not sacrificing quality.
I want to talk about this for a second a little bit more. So you recently wrote about the recent Google algorithm update and the impact that that's had. let's see. I don't quite know how to phrase what I'm going at here, so hopefully we can sort of mold all of this together. Can you talk about the intersection between that, the systems and processes, quality and quantity, and then how that plays into the role of business strategy? I don't know if we can. Let's mold that together as best as possible.
100%, 100%. There's a path here, and so this is where it starts. Google recently released three large updates, and they were all related to content quality in essence, right? There was one product called the Helpful Content Update. There was a product, an algorithm update called the Product Reviews Update, and then one general core algorithm update. And so, long story short, without going too deep into all these updates, basically the situation is the following: Google has a limited amount of resources, even though they're one of the most successful, biggest companies on earth. Every company has limited resources, and so they need to household with what websites they look at, how often they crawl them, what content they serve in their index, etc. On the other hand, it has become so much easier for pretty much anybody out there to create content. Right? You can literally write a blog just with a smartphone, or you can start a YouTube channel, TikTok, whatever, just with a smartphone. There's very low barrier to entry. You can almost start for free. So that means there's a lot more content out there. And the third kind of trend or principle is that Google search has a very limited, very finite number of results, right? So different than on social media, where it's all about how many people you connect with or what topics you're interested in. Google search, there's a limited amount of results, and Google tries to surface the best results, right? And all these three kind of trends work together, and they lead to a situation where Google has to be super picky about what type of content they show for certain keywords or search terms. And that means for us as content creators, the content has to become so much better because it competes with a lot of other content out there. And the problem is that, a lot of companies and a lot of people regard SEO content as this like commodity where you just synthesize the top results, right? You basically write a summary of what's already out there, and that doesn't provide a lot of value. And instead, the number one questions that creators have to ask themselves these days is, how can I create something that's a lot better than anything else out there?
So I'm going to dig into this just a little bit more too, because in this article, you were talking about the difference between commoditized content and so lyrics websites, for example, right? Everybody has the same thing. You can't really differentiate too much. Differentiation is really the big key. This is the thing that's on everybody's mind right now. A lot of the conversation, we're moving away from the skyscraper type technique where we're remixing the remixes of the remixes. How are you thinking about differentiation in these areas? Because Shopify is a great example of this. There are only so many topics you can cover, and there are only so many things you can say when it comes to like gift wrapping or upselling or right. So how are you thinking about differentiation both on the micro level and then on the macro level?
Love that. Love that. So starting with micro level, there are really two key questions that I ask myself for every piece of content. The one is, how is this better than anything else out there? And better has to be defined. It can be, how is this more in depth? How is this easier to understand? How is this really easy to read? How is this really well explained? And then the second thing is, how can I wow my readers? How can I provide something that goes beyond their expectations? It could be, so let's take a simple example, right? It could be something like how to, I don't know, start a t-shirt business. I'm just making something up, right? Then of course the core piece of content is just the different steps that are involved and leading the reader through that. But maybe a way to go beyond expectations would be a quick video, maybe like a 1-minute video where all the steps are just very quickly summarized or maybe shown, right? And that might make even more sense when it comes to something physical or tangible, like changing a tire or whatever. So it's all about making it easier for users to really get to the core piece of information that they're looking for. It could also be a template, right? Maybe like, here's a form, you can just sign out or reach out to us. We're going to register it for us. That obviously would be the 11-star experience of such an article. But I think we're at that point where content is not enough. It really has to be, either there has to be a specific piece of data or information that's really hard to get, or there has to be some sort of process that takes a lot of effort, that makes this piece so much better, that is harder to replicate. And so when we talk about this whole, SEO game and commodity content, the number one thing is, as you said, differentiation. And the way to differentiate is to create something that is either impossible for others to replicate or takes a ton of effort, and therefore it's only possible for you. And then on the macro level, right, it's all about understanding the different steps to getting there, right? So how can you, maybe even before you write the article, maybe even before the draft, how can you think about how to the way to make this piece of content stand out? How can you fund the content creation process with resourcing for video templates, maybe engineering little tools to make it stand out so much more, and basically win in the search results. So it's the same kind of principle or concept that we spoke about in the beginning, where you flip the process on its head and think about, okay, where's most value created? How can we front load that? How can we do that as early as possible, so that we make sure we're on top of that and don't forget it down the line.
It's something, when I talk about this with other people, I just recently, there are two things here that jump off for me. So I was talking with Janessa Lance a few months back, and she was saying something to the effect of, you have to have recall points. You have to get hooks, and people make things intentionally find recall points. So maybe that's contrarian opinions. Maybe that's just things that are counterintuitive, right? Things that, and not for the sake of being counterintuitive, but something that really injects your opinion or personality into this. And then it reminds me of another conversation I had recently off the stream, where someone had asked me, what about when it comes to what is content, right? And it's like, there's a difference between what is and then what is this to you, right? Like we all have different interpretations of what something is, and we have to build up that level of confidence to have a perspective in the market. The other part of that on the macro level is thinking about, people talk about pillar content, and the question is like, what are those pillars supporting? What's the overall message that you're supporting and putting out there into the market? So just some stuff to kind of munch on, folks. So let's get into process. That's the next section of the show, right? We have everything that we've talked about so far. Now, what's the process from getting these things from ideation out to publication?
I'm going to focus more on what I would call search-focused content, which has, in my mind, a slightly different approach than purely editorial content. And so when it comes to search, the number one goal should obviously be to be as visible in search engines as possible. That does not mean that you're just writing for a machine and not for a user, right? Those go more and more hand in hand. And so everything should start, in my mind, with topics you want to own. In the process, in the example of say like a finance company, that can be things like bill pay, account management, or accounting, bookkeeping. Large topics that make sense for your product, that your target audience is interested in. And then from there, you want to do the kind of classic keyword research process, where you want to look at, okay, what are all the things that people search for? Then there's a step where you want to group all of these keywords to the same intent. And so user intent is one of the number one things in SEO these days. It's something like a binary thing. Well, actually, let's stick with binary just to simplify it. You either meet user intent or you don't. And the way that user intent is different from keywords is that the user intent is really, what are people trying to achieve? It can be as simple as, I want to understand what something is, definition. But it can also be as complex as, I want to learn how to do something, right? Something like, I want to learn how to register my own LLC, for example. And so user intents can be expressed with different keywords. Sometimes looking just for LLC can actually mean that users want to learn how to set up an LLC, but they're just, maybe they don't phrase the query like that, or they expect that those type of results show up, right? So we have the topic identification, keyword research, user intent identification, and then you can basically write an article for every user intent.
I'm going to stop you right there.
Sure.
I'm going to stop you. We talk about user intent a lot, right? And you just said finding user intent. Dig into that, please.
Sure. So there's a big kind of fancy approach to doing that, and then there's a very kind of human manual approach to doing that. So the fancy approach is, you can basically look at all the different elements on the search results, and that they will tell you what Google's interpretation of user intent is. So it can be things like a featured snippet at the top, something like a direct answer. It can be an image carousel, video carousel, maps, ads, all these kind of things. So when you deal with thousands and thousands of keywords, and like you ask yourself, how can I identify user intent for all of those? You basically extract all the SERP features or the elements in the search results that appear for every keyword, and you can classify user intent for keywords. For writers, it's much more of a manual approach most of the times. You get a topic or a keyword, and then you look at the search results, and you want to look for a couple of pointers. One of them, as I said, is what elements is Google showing? They all follow a pattern, right? So if you have a lot of images and videos, it's probably inspiration or a how-to type of intent. If it's a featured snippet at the top, it's probably I call this like a shallow piece of information that people are trying to find out. It's typically a list or a direct answer to a specific question. They know exactly what they're looking for. And then you also want to look at what other sites are ranking in the top spots for this keyword. Are these landing pages, like product landing pages? Are these blog articles? Are these results from publishers? All of that, you take all of that together and you get an understanding of what is appearing in the search results, because that's Google's interpretation of user intent, and that's what matters most. Sometimes it's crystal clear, okay, people are looking for a manual or a tutorial or a step-by-step. Other times it's much more complex. People might even they might not even know exactly what format they're looking for or what they're trying to accomplish, right? So you look at the search results, who's competing, and that should give you an idea of what the user intent is.
Now, we're going to go back. It's a cart and horse scenario, chicken and egg scenario. You see the intent based on the interpretation of what Google's talking about, what they're surfacing. How do you then not do samey?
Yes, absolutely. It's a fantastic question. It comes back to kind of this idea of stepping into the meta level, where you say, okay, this is the keyword that they're looking for, maybe how to start an LLC. What are they actually trying to accomplish, right? The first step is, or the kind of like in the weeds thought is, they want to register an LLC. What are you talking about? But there are a lot of meta questions that people have along the way, like what do I, what forms do I have to fill out and send? Can I register it online? Am I qualified to register an LLC, right? So that's kind of what I mean by stepping on the meta level and asking yourself, okay, what are people actually trying to accomplish? What is obvious, but what is maybe not so obvious? And that gives you an edge, because now you can make that experience much more seamless, smoother, and maybe faster than anybody else out there who's stuck in the weeds type of perspective.
It's funny you say that. So at QuickBooks, I did a lot of that type of content, right? How to register an LLC and all of that. And when it came time to actually register my own LLC, I realized that a lot of what we were talking about, and I hate to say this, but like a lot of what we were talking about, it turned out that there wasn't a lot of useful stuff out there. And part of that was lived experience.
Totally.
And just so we can sort of keep moving, a lot of the lived experience thing, as authors, as creators in general, even as content leads, which is who we're really talking to here, if you don't have your own lived experience, you have to talk to people with those lived experiences, because you could be like, there has to be conversation happening out there. We can't just assume what user intent is by looking at what Google's telling us, because Google is still only a set of robots, right? So we want to talk about differentiation. We want to talk about all of that. Real human perspective is always, always, always necessary, especially in this realm of that. So anyways, we went on a tangent here about that. Let's keep talking about process for a little bit, and then I would love to get into your pregame.
Sure. What you're saying is super central, right? It's like this idea that a marketer can write about everything without talking to experts. That's over, right? That's really what Google is pushing for as well. It's like this lived experience, actually understanding the topic. And so, when we talk about process, after identifying user intent and understanding what the angle should be for the piece as well, how to make that piece better than everything else out there, right? And how to wire your users, then you can step back into the classic, draft, editing, refinement, editing, publishing. The one thing that I really want to call out though that might be, I'm not even sure if it's just unique to SEO content, but it's certainly crucial to SEO content, is to look at content from a lifecycle perspective. The work is not done when the piece of content is published. It's also not done when you send it to your email list and made some noise on social and all that kind of stuff. The work is never done. And so you have to have a plan for how to groom and maintain content, right? The time where you just publish and forget it is really over. And instead, you have to have a process for understanding when to go back to a piece of content, update it or refresh it. So typically, there are a couple of steps when it comes to the post-publishing stage of content. One is to say, okay, does it actually achieve its target performance? A lot of times I use a target keyword and see, okay, does it actually rank number one for the target keyword? And it almost never instantly does, right? The times where you hit a bullseye on your first throw is very rare. So a lot of times it maybe plateaus on position 5, 3, sometimes on the second page. And then you have to go back and revise the content and see, okay, did we forget anything? Were any subtopics not covered well? Is the title well optimized and all that kind of stuff? You tweak it a little bit and then it often ranks a little higher. And so you have to go back and keep tweaking until it ranks really well. And then there's also going to be a point of decay. So content decay is one of these things that way too many people are not talking about, but it's absolutely crucial. And so what you often see is in the life cycle stages of a piece of content, right? It gets traction, it gets some refinement, it eventually ranks number one and maximizes potential. And then after a while, the performance goes back down. And that's simply, there are many reasons for that. Sometimes it's a technical SEO thing where you just publish new content. That piece of content gets buried deeper in the internal linking structure of the site. Like that's a technical reason. But very often it's just competition, right? Other sites publish content and they try to one-up you, and maybe they found a way to make it so much better. And these are all things that are super, super important to factor in and take into account. So you have to then decide, okay, when do we touch a piece of content again when it decays? What's our criteria? And what are the things that we then do? What is the process that a writer should go through or an editor to say, okay, this piece of content is decaying in traffic or rankings. Now let's go back and update and refresh that. And the companies that nail that process down, that understand the content lifecycle and all the different stages, those are the companies where you typically see the organic traffic going, almost in an S-curve that just like skyrocket.
I don't want to underestimate the ability of internal linking too, as far as, if we're looking at quick wins that people were looking for. I have the experience of writing an article about best website or best way to make a website or something along those lines. And we ended up pointing about 100 internal links to this particular page. And we saw it go from 98 up to number 5, right? So to kind of reiterate on the point that a piece of content is never done, we can't be forgetting about this stuff. And it's really easy to set up different automations to remind you to go back to revisit certain pieces, especially if you know that they're going to be high value pieces. Let's see here. We have a couple of questions that we can go into before we talk about pregame. Alex K says, we have 2 SaaS websites, one category, photo editors, but the first is B2C, decent traffic and domain authority. Second is enterprise B2B, newer domain, low DA. Any content marketing SEO tips for cases like this? It's actually a great question because we had that same challenge between Shopify Core and Shopify Plus in the early days.
Totally. I love that question because it points at the challenge that content can fulfill different functions and can have different roles when it comes to attribution. So in D2C or any consumer type of product, oftentimes content and conversion points are much closer to each other, right? So you will have situations where readers convert on the spot on the article. They either go straight to the product landing page and buy the product, or they sign up for a newsletter, they sign up for the product. That can happen, and that is almost impossible on the enterprise side because you have a handoff between marketing and sales, right? They turn into marketing qualified leads, and then it's kind of the job of the sales organization. And it's not that the handoff per se is problematic. It is much more that on the B2B side, especially in the enterprise segment, you see a lot more whales, which are huge deals that come through a piece of content, and sometimes you're surprised by it. Like they went to a glossary and then they got in touch with sales and then they spent $1 million on a product. Like, how does that make sense? And on the D2C side, right, it's much closer conversion. It makes, it's much easier to attribute, and it makes much more sense a lot of times. These are two different approaches. And what I learned about the enterprise side is that the paths to conversion are often non-linear. And you want to take into account that there are different types of conversions. There's obviously the fill out the form, get in touch with sales, and that's a hard conversion in my definition. But then there are also soft conversions, like sign up for an email newsletter, sign up for our webinars, those kind of softer things. And a even softer conversion would be click to this other article, right? We understand you're at the very early on in your user journey. And instead of trying to sell you hard right now, this is the next piece you should really read. And then there's this other piece, and then maybe you're ready for a soft conversion. So mapping that out and measuring that is kind of the key to solving the problem on the enterprise level.
And focusing really heavily on the technical questions that people might have. So if it's a software, like what are my security features? What are the implementations that I can do? Like a number of those types of things, because in many cases, especially in enterprise B2B, people have made their decision before they even come to you. So now they're looking at, how can I get this? What are the actual steps to get this done? And because the sales cycle lasts so long, if you're able to think about how this content can be distributed through sales or through your sales reps and beyond the channels that are normally beyond your control, something really important to consider there as well. And that's, I think, one of the biggest gaps that people have. This is something that I know I struggled with for a long time. So something to really think about there. All right, let's talk about, we're running a little over time on this part of things, but let's talk a little bit about your pregame, and then we'll jump straight into the edit.
Yeah. Pregame for me is pretty non-spectacular. I like a good cup of coffee. That makes me productive in general. And since I drink coffee only in the morning, that's kind of my best time to edit. Number two is I like some good music on my ears. I'm a huge fan of soundtracks, movie soundtracks. That's really my jam. And then number
Who are you listening to right now?
The soundtrack of the Lord of the Rings show. That was Bear McCreary. Did an amazing job of that. I was very surprised. And yeah, to me, I don't know why, but I think it's because there's no lyrics, so it's not too distracting. And it just gets me in a mood. I'm a person. I used to be a DJ. I used to produce some music. I'm a person who just can change their mood with music instantly. So getting like some epic soundtracks on my ears can really help me to get in the right mindset and like tackle a meaty project. It's a little, razzle dazzle, but it works for me. And then the third thing is I sometimes read a couple of pieces that I love and that I think fit to the piece of content that I'm editing, right? So for my own newsletter, for example, and I never put the amount of time into editing that I actually want to just to say it. But I read some stuff by maybe Ben Thompson, who I'm a huge fan of, or maybe Scott Galloway, and I'm just like, okay, like how can I internalize a little bit of their voice, a little bit of their style, the way that they build a piece, the way that they conclude a piece. How can I like take a little chunk with that on my own journey and use it when I edit?
I love that. Let's move on to the next section of the show. Let's jump straight into the edit. Before we get into the deep edits here too, what was your first impression of the piece?
I think it was a good piece. To me, a very typical kind of case. And I think that there are a couple of things to make this stand out a lot more and take it from, to basically make it something that really stands out and could potentially wow the users.
All right. Wonderful. And we're going to do a caveat that you are a very blunt and brutal editor. Now let's jump straight in.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. I want to emphasize that once again, I note, I'm German, okay? So we're very straightforward folks in general. And I also try to give the feedback just straight up. But please know that it's all coming from a place of respect and love, and that I believe that the author is truly skilled. And I just try to highlight things very clearly so that the audience can understand that and doesn't have to peel the layers, right? So just want to say that up front, all coming from the place of respect and love. The thing is, when I started reading this, or when I look at any piece of content, the reality is that users, readers, your target audience has a very, most of the times, a low attention span. And I totally understand that people watched or listened to 3-hour Joe Rogan shows, they binge Netflix, right? So there are counterexamples. But when we think about the environment that this piece of content will compete in, it's either going to be a social feed where you basically get a millisecond to evaluate if you want to click on something, or a feed reader, or it's going to be the search results. And so people are very quick with the decision to read a piece or not. And that's why the headline, or the title has to really hit it home and capture people's attention. It doesn't have to be clickbaity, but it has to be click-worthy. And I thought that this title felt very generic. It felt a little flat in my mind. And I wonder, how can we make this a bit more relatable and a bit more, attract a little more attention from the target audience? So I would wonder, what's the core piece that people need to understand here? Or what's the core risk of not understanding this this article? And so I wonder if a potential headline, and to be honest, I would come up with 5 different headlines. I would even consider testing them against each other, maybe on paid social campaigns or something, if you want to go the extra mile. But I wonder if a better headline here could be something along the lines of like how cognitive biases can manipulate the content value chain or something like that, or 4 ways cognitive biases lead to bad results, or stuff like that. It doesn't have to be super clickbaity where you promise the world and only deliver a peanut, but it has to be something that where people go, oh, okay, this is probably something I should pay attention to. Next, once readers click through to the piece, they are going to look at the first paragraph, right? They're probably going to do this. They're probably going to skim, right? I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. But the paragraph has to quickly draw them in. So you're basically playing this game where the headline needs to capture attention, the first sentence has to capture attention, the first paragraph has to capture attention, the second one probably as well. And once people are a little more drawn in and bought in, then you can slow things down and you can go more into depth. But these initial first couple of sentences are just going to be crucial. And that is the same for search engine optimization as it is for content you create primarily for social, right? So here I'm even thinking about ways to maybe even have single sentences in their own paragraph and maybe not even several sentences. It's a bit more like stylistic and up to the author and editor, but it's super important that this first paragraph draws in attention. And I didn't get that impression from this piece of content. I thought that the author could lean way more into how is this topic new, surprising, interesting, or challenging a belief that people have, right? It could be something like, actually, most people think they know all the cognitive biases, but they actually don't, right? Or people know the cognitive biases, but they still don't apply them, or they don't put in the mechanics to avoid them. So it has to go a little beyond, and I thought that this was a little bit too. There was a piece of the content that I thought was a little redundant. Whenever I write my content, I really try to get to the main hook as quickly as possible. And part of that is to just reduce the cognitive load in the piece of content. And reducing cognitive load means just to strip off everything that doesn't really help draw people in. Yeah, I thought this sentence can probably be taken out. And then I like that there's a table of content here. Table of content can avoid that people skim and scroll around, right? It makes it very easy for them to say, okay, what are all the things that are covered here? We're going to come back to some of these chapter headings here. But yeah, I think when you provide a table of content, you want to follow that same principle. You want to have headings that draw people in. And I don't think there's something per se wrong with saying, okay, let's define this first. I thought the sequencing here was a little bit out of place. I would actually, for the people who don't know, I would start with what a cognitive bias is and then go into the content value chain. And the reason is simply that I think it's important for people to first understand cognitive biases and then how they apply to the content value chain. That's how we do it. Some readers will probably skip the what is or definition and go straight into cognitive biases. Depends a little bit on where in the user journey they are.
This is actually a great point to go back into Royce's question, because he did clarify in here. Google considers something helpful by length or depth of the article, such as number of tips, or is a user intent match more important?
Yeah, I love that question because I actually think I have a bit of a contrarian stance to that. And my assumption is that the question comes a little bit from this skyscraper method in the past where you basically look at, okay, what ranks well for this keyword? Okay, it's the 10 best tips for X. And then you just go along and you create the 15 best tips for X. And that can work sometimes, but the point where you take user intent into account is that sometimes people don't want to have more options, they want to have better options. And so you need to apply a little bit of your own brain juice and a little bit of common sense to think about, okay, does it really help if I offer more tips? Or can I narrow it down to the 3 best tips? Or here are the best tips that are actually vetted by experts, right? Again, it comes back to what are people actually trying to achieve? And in some cases, it might be a pure selection numbers game, and then it's fair to one up each other. Just know that this is a bottomless race. And then other times, you can actually one up other sites or results by just narrowing the selection down and saying, hey, you don't need 99 Father's Day gift ideas. Here are the 3 ones that 90% of fathers love. And I would argue that works much, much better.
It used to be the case where it seemed to be the more tips you gave or the more whatever, the higher the word count. But like now, starting to see this just from a qualitative standpoint, people are going 7,000 words. Whew, let me get off of that one. It's not depth. We're optimizing for, it's not deep in the sense that it's actually deep. It's just long for the sake of being long.
Exactly. 100%. So it goes back to making it easier, making the experience more delightful, basically. And table of contents can help with that. The question, they will probably serve a skimming or overview kind of purpose here. And then you want to really go back and ask yourself, okay, what are the things that people might pay attention to? So it might even make sense to Google the target keyword here and look at, okay, what tips or structures are other pieces following? Can I make this even easier or even better? Yeah, anyway, I'm gonna pause there. I think I said a lot about table of contents. I'm gonna continue with some more in-depth stuff here. I already mentioned that I think this section might be a better sequence after the what is cognitive bias definition. When we dive into the content value chain, I think that the way you want to think about headings these days is you want to almost take them literally. And you want to almost think about it as a conversation. And I already mentioned, I'm German, I like to get straight to the point. And I think what's missing here is just a definition of the content value chain. So if you start a heading with defining content value chain or what is cognitive bias, the next sentence should start with content value chain is X or cognitive bias is X. There's a user reason for that. I don't think in this piece of content you want to keep tension for too long. You basically want to give them the answer straight away. And then there's also an SEO reason that if you follow a heading that's what is related or definition related, and you answer that heading in the paragraph with the definition, Google might reward you with a featured snippet, right? With an instant answer in the search results that tends to draw a lot of attention and gets you a lot more traffic. So that's my thinking process about this one. These points are all valid, but they're not defining what the content value chain is, right? Love the graphics. I think good custom graphics always make a piece of content better. So whenever you can visualize something, that is a way to improve the user experience, make it easier for people to grasp the concept. That can see, okay, there are 5 steps involved here in the content value chain. There's some subtopics here or some tasks that have to be done for every piece of content. I like the logo. The one little critique, if I had to bring one, right, is there's probably a potential to make this graphic even easier to read. I think the orange shading can make it a bit harder actually, but I know this is not a design critique. Yeah, I'm going to be very passive about this. Okay, and so then we follow up with the definition of all the different steps. And yeah, I noticed that something here might have been missing from the sentence. Maybe something got lost in editing or something else. I don't know, but it reads, generally the above are the steps involved in the content value chain, and cognitive biases can easily affect some of them. When you close out a chapter, in my mind, instead of summarizing what you did before, you can do that, but I think there has to be a conclusion of the chapter. It's okay to say, okay, these are the steps involved in the content value chain, but that's, people already know this, right? The reader already knows this. And so instead, I wonder what can be the bridge to the next chapter, or what is something that you synthesize out of the chapter content, right? Maybe there's a speed of going through these different steps, or maybe the subtasks are all related, or if you do the subtasks in the right order, then you get through the process much faster. But some piece of additional insight at the conclusion that doesn't just quote unquote repeat what the reader already knows, I think would be very valuable here.
It's what I call the difference between the roller coaster and the waterfall.
I love that. What does that mean? Can you elaborate?
Yeah, so the roller coaster is where you ramp up at the beginning of the subheader, and then you talk about the thing that you're supposed to be talking about, and then you come to a final conclusion at the end, and then you do the same thing for the next subheader over and over again, instead of drawing somebody further down the page by making a different, continuing on the thought that you were on before.
Nice. I love that. That's super powerful. Cool. Okay, so moving on, what is cognitive bias? I think, and this is probably like a recurring point that I'm making throughout the piece, but I think this could be a bit livelier. And I do understand that sometimes topics are dry and you don't always need to add color to dry things like accounting. Some topics are just dry and you don't need to be cringed by trying to make them actually super exciting. But I think this is actually one of the cases where you can add a lot more color and make this a bit more relatable. And one way is just to say something lively. Hey, remember the last time you thought a piece of content was bad because you disagreed with the points it made? That's actually confirmation bias in action. And so I think there's so many, because everybody has cognitive biases, right? As a writer, you want to play a little bit with showing how the reader, her or himself, falls prey to some cognitive biases, right? And I think that would make the piece a bit more livelier, relatable, maybe even create some thoughts in the reader's mind of, oh, shoot, yeah, I do this all the time. This makes perfect sense. I really want to figure out how to avoid that. And to be fair, I earlier made a point to say that whenever you have a what is heading, you want to answer the question. You want to do that first, and then you want to maybe dive into some like lively, relatable examples. So the way I would write it here is to say, okay, what is cognitive bias? Cognitive bias is blah, 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 blah. New paragraph, remember the last time, etc. And I think that would be an easy way to satisfy what users are actually wanting to do after they read the heading, but then also make it relatable to them. Here we have the definition. Again, I would move that under the heading, change the sequence of these two paragraphs here. I actually think that's a good definition. It's just the sequencing is a little off here. And then we have the history of cognitive bias as we know it. And this is a classic commodity content mistake, I want to say, where you think about a topic and then you're like, we should probably explain the history of that topic. And I think there's an opportunity here to weave that better into the overall content, right? So the number one question that you basically always want to ask yourself about a paragraph and the chapter is, why is this important to know? Why does the reader need to know this? And the way that it's presented here, it's almost, I think you can probably rather take it out. By the way, I suggest, this is my personal philosophy, purely stylistic recommendation, but I would never have a bulleted list if you only have 2 bullet points. Again, just my personal thoughts here. But I think you can actually weave this very well into the following paragraph by asking yourself, why is this important? And so the writer actually does that really well. She or he writes, for years, marketers have been leveraging consumer psychology and cognitive biases to their advantage to convince people. And so you already have the connection here, right? This is not, cognitive biases are not new. And so the way that you can weave that in here is you can write something like, already in the 1970s, the two famous psychologists, Tversky and Kahneman, wrote about leveraging consumer psychology and cognitive biases to their advantage to convince people. And then boom, you have the historic facts, and they make sense because they're important to know in order to understand that this is not new, that this is actually something that humans have dealt with for a long time. Cool. One thing about these headings. So These headings basically dive into 4 different cognitive biases. And I don't know this for certain, but my story is that the writer tried to make the headings a bit more interesting and enticing. But the challenge is that these headings tend to stand on their own, and it's very hard to understand how they actually make sense in the overall structure of the article. So if you go back to the table of contents, we have definition of content value chain, definition of cognitive biases, and then we have 4 headings that don't really fit in. You don't really understand, okay, how does that make sense? Like, how does Chinese whisper make sense here? And so I would actually, in this case, recommend to use the type of bias as the heading. So it could be something like just using confirmation bias for this heading. It could also be something a bit more enticing, right? It could be a way to provide, I don't know, like an example, right? Confirmation bias dash thinking you know it or thinking you're right or whatever. So you can flesh this out a little bit, but I don't think you have to. The purpose of this heading is really just to signal to the reader, hey, this is a new section, and that's what the section is about. Totally fine. We're not talking about the heading of the article.
Yeah, and there's research that supports, like, even if you are locked into your belief, and this might be something we're trying to come up with the example flat earth versus round earth, but there's research that supports if you believe something, no matter how much counter evidence you're given, you're not going to change your belief, or it takes an infinite amount more convincing for that belief to change. And that might be something that's really interesting to bring in here.
100%. Yes. Even pointing that fact out, right, could create some positive tension for the reader to be like, oh, okay, most people don't want to change or cannot change their mind. Opens the question, but can I? Is there a way? Is there a trick? Is there a hack? Or is it hopeless? And if it is, then how should I deal with that? So I totally agree with you, Tommy. You can lean on the research. You can make this fact-based. I think it's important to make this fact-based. And very descriptive. There were some examples here in the text that I thought could just be related to the content value chain. So this is much more keeping the piece together. This is more minuscule. Again, I think there's an opportunity here. I like that there are different graphics for these subheadings and that they make it easier to understand. There's some color coding here. That's amazing. Love that. There are also a couple of open claims that I think are important, like confirmation bias is one of the common biases product marketers fall for. In the content value chain, it can impact topic research and content consumption, but then doesn't exactly explain how it does that, right? It explains what happens here with topic research and content consumption, but what's the solve? What's the how? And I think there's a little bit of depth missing here. And it's a little bit too shallow in my mind, right? Coming back to how to wow your users, how to go above and beyond expectations, you're basically telling them, hey, there are these 4 things, these 4 biases that can manipulate your work, right? That can basically be a trap, but then you really have to fulfill that kind of promise or question with a very strong answer. And I thought there are some of these solutions here in boxes, and I thought that's where a lot of the meat of the article actually is, or a lot of the value comes from. It could be something like, hey, here are 3 steps to avoid confirmation bias in the content value chain. Or this is how the experts do it, right? Here's like a world-class writer and how they avoid confirmation bias. Or this is, so make this a bit more useful and helpful for the audience, I would say.
There's something in here as well where if we're talking about confirmation bias, and this comes down to intent, and this comes down to the knowing the reader, but dealing with other people's confirmation bias. There's an opportunity here. If we can identify that, how can we help our colleagues who are also part of a buying decision to get out of their bias? There's a point of differentiation there, I think.
Yes, 100%. A little mini playbook. And it doesn't have to be this huge thing. It can also be just a step-by-step of how to involve your colleagues, how to bias check each other, right? Like something tangible that the reader now takes away and can bring to the team or to the company and say, this is how we make this better. I totally agree. This could be a point of differentiation here. Cool. I repeated the same recommendation throughout all the headings, so no need to go through all of these. Same with some of these other solutions. Again, I think we spoke about this at length. And then I just wanted to make another point about the conclusion. So we spoke about this before, but it's okay to summarize in a conclusion. But these days, especially if you want to lead to an action from the reader, you need to take it a bit further, right? There needs to be an actual conclusion that goes beyond just a summary. I thought the end here was a little bit abrupt. And again, I thought that there were some questions raised here. That's really the meat of the article, right? That's really where a lot of the value can come from. And the last thing we're going to say is that coming back to the two questions that I always ask myself, right, is like, how is this better than anything out there? And how can you wow the reader? And so I think one thing here could be amazing, could be just a free Google Doc or maybe a gated PDF where readers get like maybe the top 10 tips to avoid all these biases that were mentioned in the article, right? Or maybe a spreadsheet that maps the content value chain and at every step shows the biases that people have to avoid. So I think that would make it super useful, super applicable. And yeah, I wonder like, where's the call to action? And that can sometimes also live outside of the main content, but the end here is basically, oh, thanks for coming. See you later. It could be, thanks for coming. Here's this next thing you should really check out, or here's this other thing you should download, or here's how maybe our software makes it super easy to avoid all of these biases. A lot of potential here in the end. And these are basically all the recommendations that I have. Again, I want to point out that this comes from a place of respect and love. And I hope I wasn't too harsh.
We'll take the screen share off here and join us back. And I want to encourage anybody, if you can stay just a couple minutes over here, Kevin, it'd be great if anybody in the audience has any questions we can answer. But on the summary, I just went to a Gorillaz concert last week, and what I thought was interesting about the way that they ended the show was that it was almost the way you were talking about here, where before they came on and did the encore for, the two songs that everybody's really there to hear, they just said, okay, good night, and then walked off. And I see that so often with so many different articles, but it was like this perfect representation of what you see so often in articles. And then, they came back on and they played Feel Good Inc. and, Clint Eastwood, and it was awesome.
Nice.
But it was something that capped the night off, right? Or it gave you something next to do or something to look forward to before they, closed it off entirely. So I'm going to check the chat here, see if we have any other additional questions.
Sure. You check the chat. Going to comment on Gorillaz. First of all, amazing band. Never seen them live. Really would love to. But to just like go back and step on the meta level again, right? Like you build all this expectations with the first couple of paragraphs and the title of the piece, right? And then you actually get the attention of the reader. The reader gets a ton of value throughout the content. And then you have this state that the reader is in where they're like, man, I didn't think this was going to be that good. Like now that's way beyond my expectations, right? And the reader is now ready to get more from you, and you need to make it super easy for them. And it can just be, this is the next piece you should read, but you have them now. And then just quitting and walking away is a missed opportunity. So I just wanted to highlight that again.
Yeah, I totally think that's something we should, from a technical perspective too, like from a content marketing leads perspective and from an author's perspective, this is something we should intentionally focus on, right? It's really easy to just look at getting all the different pieces out there. But if we can focus on technique and practice in these specific areas, it's going to be so much better. And really think about the technique of how these things are done. So yes. I want to say thank you everybody for coming. Kevin, thank you so much for coming on. Is there any place that we should find you online?
You can find me on my website where I also publish my newsletter called Growth Memo. The website is kevin-indig.com, or Twitter or LinkedIn, where I also post quite a bit.
Thanks so much for watching. If you like that episode, please leave a comment and a like down below. And if you want to be notified about future episodes, please go to thecontentstudio.com/thecuttingroom, enter your email address. You'll also get replays and other exclusive bonuses. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next one.